What is it like to be an artillery crew in Bakhmut, fighting off daily Russian artillery, ground assaults, aircraft, you name it? This report gives us a look inside their lives and how they use drones to maximize every round. Let's get into it. Okay, what's crazy first off is that this looks like largely a, post-World War II piece of artillery, probably from, I'm going to guess and say the 60s or 70s. It looks like self-propelled artillery. It doesn't really have, it has some armor, but it's certainly not a tank.
Да, зараз цей напрямок, в принципі, найважливіший на фронті. Всі бачать, яка м'ясорубка відбувається під Бах.
It's interesting the way that it started as kind of a meme, but has spread progressively, that now almost every side agrees that Bakhmut is a meat grinder. The question is, who's getting ground down the worst? And it seems consistently like that is actually the Russians. Now, the question, though, is the real biggest question in Bakhmut is how much more can the Russians burn relative to Ukraine? Because let's say the Russian army can replenish itself and re-equip itself, hypothetically, at 4 times the rate of Ukraine. That means that if Russia burns 4 troops to get 1 Ukrainian KIA or WIA, as long as they're out of the fight, then it becomes a worthwhile endeavor. It's actually a Russian victory. So that's sort of the question on everyone's mind is, how can Ukraine preserve its combat power? How much deeper are its reserves? Ukraine obviously has had a general mobilization for a long time, so it's not clear on how much you're going to see growth in the Ukrainian armed forces.
І він відіграє ключову роль в обороні всього сходу нашої держави. Ці умови, я б сказав, що...
I love this euphemism compared to the heroism our infantry is going through right now. Yeah, definitely. There are so many benefits in terms of operations when you have a vehicle, when you're mechanized.
Прийнятні порівняно з тим, які геройство чинить наша піхота зараз, то в якому багні, болоті вона працює, то я вважаю, що у нас нормальні умови. У нас є техніка.
Right. This is actually a really good point. Sleeping in the mud and dirt is not just extremely uncomfortable, it's actually dangerous. Getting wet in the field when you can't get dry is a huge, huge physical health risk. Trench foot is the World War II disease that or most notable in World War II, but it was where water would get inside the boots of soldiers in trenches and then would begin to rot away at their feet. And because, of course, the environment of the boot was warm, wet, it was a breeding ground for dangerous bacteria, for staph and gangrene that would begin to eat away at the foot. In the era before antibiotics, it was potentially lethal, but even today, that would still necessitate an infantry soldier coming off of the front line, leaving their comrades, right, effectively becoming a WIA, but without enemy fire being involved at all. In contrast, when you look at a tank, you can close up the hatches and get dry or drier, and you can sleep somewhere off of the ground so that you don't sleep in the rain and the mud. You also can have the heat of the engine, and he's going to talk a second about stoves where you can use that ambient heat to dry things. It can also, of course, heat up food, which is also very significant and not easy to do. All of those things are so powerful. Plus, a vehicle can tow more comforts, right? Light infantry, if you can't put it on your back, you're not going to take it. So even things like, hey, we can take an entire case of water is something that we would keep in our vehicles. We would keep extra MREs in our vehicles, so that we could, even if there were some level of disruption or an op went long, we still had stuff to eat. This can be huge. You could also even bring cots. We would put cots in the back of our vehicles so that when we had to, if we found a safe patrol base to sleep at, we could actually sleep on a cot, which again, if you've ever done any field work, you know that a cot might as well be a 5-star hotel compared to sleeping on the bare ground.
Випадок, де ми можемо переночувати. Ми не знаходимося під постійними обстрілами. У нас іноді є можливість там зігрітися тут, да, тому що в техніці там...
To be clear, this was a conflict where there wasn't that much indirect fire or artillery, so sleeping in cots was actually like fine. In our particular AO, insurgents didn't use indirect fire hardly at all. The terrain was too open; they wouldn't be able to exfil properly. And so we felt safe sleeping in cots as long as it was in a secured compound with guards on duty. In contrast, of course, in this conflict with indirect fire being a huge part of it, I would never in a million years sleep in a cot out in the open. But again, would I sleep in a building, and maybe a basement of a building, in a cot that I had brought in my tank? Yeah, probably.
Є котел, наприклад.
І так, працюємо, бляха.
Акація – це найпотужніша бригадна артилерія, тобто ці установки, як правило, ведуть вогонь для прикриття своєї ж власної піхоти на передовій. Оскільки роботи доволі багато, то гармати працюють зі стаціонарних позицій.
This is really interesting that these work from stationary positions. They don't fire and move.
Тобто після ведення вогню їх не змінюють.
Це залежить від цілі. Тобто на одну ціль ми можемо, наприклад, там витратити 30, на іншу ми можемо витратити 40. Тобто залежить від цілі, поки ми не досягнемо того результату, який ми хочемо досягнути. Як тільки ми досягли цього результату, відповідно, робота по цілі завершується.
Тихо.
That is such a big artillery piece. But what's also interesting, of course, is that as mobile, it's funny that they're using mobile artillery as stationary artillery. It's interesting to me because, again, the appeal of mobile artillery is that it can move. And if you look at things like an M777 howitzer, those are largely static. You have to set them up, you set up a firing position, and then you can engage your targets. But it's a little tougher to move an M777, whereas this is designed to just start the engine up and relocate. But it's possible that because of how the ranges work, right? If they're providing cover to frontline troops, let me just make this a little bigger. I'm going to actually try to sketch it for you guys. So let's say this is the front line. Pretend this is a map, right? This is what I should probably get an editor. Okay, so that's the front line, right? So here are Ukrainian troops, and here are Russian troops, right? That doesn't help. Okay, so then if let's say you have Russian artillery here, right? And it's got a fixed range that puts it here, then you could, in theory, have these guys who have the same range. See what I'm talking about, right? You see how that if the Russian forces had the battery with a fixed range that can reach a little bit beyond Ukrainian lines, then this unit, because it doesn't need to reach, it only needs to reach a little bit beyond Ukrainian lines to suppress Russian advances, they can be further behind Russian lines and be out of artillery range. You see what I mean? How if you know the ranges, and this is why some of this modern equipment is so valuable, and especially stuff like the HIMARS, you can position yourself in a place where Russian artillery can't touch you, but you can touch their ground forces. Anyway, that's just a way to think about these sort of artillery duels that we talk about.
Мічман.
Здається, це вже влітку було, в червні. Був такий приємний момент, що ми відпрацювали, по нам почався обстріл, контрбатарейна на нас почали працювати. Ми сховалися в укриття, чекаємо. І тут чуємо, як у нас із-за спини.
So they took counter-battery fire, they hid and went and started to wait. Meanwhile, the M777s behind them started to engage. So I think this is their way of saying that the 777s probably just have an overall longer range, and they were counter-battery for the counter-battery fire.
Починає працювати 3 сімки. От по контрбатарейна, скажімо так, проти ворога.
He's saying counter-attack, but he said batarenas, so I think it's counter-battery. Our counter batteries were engaging their counter batteries. This is the artillery duels that we talk about.
І ворог заткнувся, і так було приємно. Ми навіть не знали, що є такий сервіс взагалі в наявності. Щоб було кому заткнути тих, хто намагається заткнути нас. Це от найстрашніше, мабуть, для артилериста – це побачити або...
This is really interesting that it sounds like a couple months ago, there was a tremendous artillery advantage for Russia. And now that artillery advantage, it sounds like they're trying to say, has been equalized somewhat. This is probably, as we've heard, Ukraine is much more disciplined and has become much more disciplined in its artillery fire. It also has better, newer equipment, so it can be more accurate, right? Some of the interviews we've heard have said that they are around twice as accurate. They can do in 4 rounds what a Russian artillery piece can do in 8. And while that doesn't sound like a tremendous difference, when you multiply it across thousands of artillery pieces, doing dozens of fire missions in a given week, you end up in a situation where the difference in logistical demand is actually huge.
Найчастіше почути звук пташки в небі. Оце найстрашніше, тому що ти розумієш, що по тобі будуть стріляти до тих пір, поки не попадуть, а коли попадуть, то ще накинуть.
So this looks like a military, possibly probably a military grade drone. You can see it's got thermal imaging, right? It's actually looking out across the battlefield. It's really interesting to see the way that, I guess these trees, these are tree lines is my guess. They could also be irrigation canals, but it looks like they are a little warmer. So maybe the trees are like retaining heat, but these look like actual, you could see literally the what I think are the engine blocks of vehicles, which is fascinating.
Якщо порівняти з півднем, наприклад, і зараз Бахмутський напрямок, то тут противник скупчив свої сили, вогнові сили, також радіоборотьбу. Набагато складніше працювати.
Yeah, this is fascinating that now we're starting to see drones and drone jamming. A really, really interesting choice and a sign that, as we talked about, as the war drags on, technological advantages are going to get mitigated. And this is just a universal truth of human beings in combat. We even saw in the Iraq war, Iraqi insurgents would develop workarounds for U.S. military technologies, right? That's how they figured out that they developed IEDs in the first place. And they used to have, for years, they did cell phone detonated IEDs, but the U.S. military developed cell phone jamming technology that protected its vehicles. So then they went to infrared IEDs that were triggered when the heat of an engine block would pass by an infrared sensor. But then the U.S. military developed, they called it a rhino horn. It was basically a big arm that would extend off the front of the Humvee that would trigger IR sensors. It would become really hot and it would prematurely detonate the IEDs. Then they went over to pressure plate IEDs and command wire IEDs. And the evolution of technology, even though one side had the full weight of the U.S. military research and development budget behind it, and the other side was just a bunch of guys in workshops tinkering, they still, with enough time, were able to equalize those technological advantages and find a sort of equilibrium. That's what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing Russia figure out ways to deal with the tremendous advantage that Ukraine has in drone technology.
Якщо взяти по дронах, тут відбувається така
And we're seeing the opposite, right? Look at the success rates of Ukrainian air defenses of shooting down Russian drones. They're getting better and better.
насиченість якби боротьби дронів і артилерії.
Дуже сильно працює ворожий реп. Ми вже мали втрати, на жаль. Буває так, що реп працює на низькій висоті, буває, що він працює на 200 метрів, 250 метрів. Це все треба прощупувати, це вже все з досвідом. Деколи болісним досвідом, тому що хто не літає, той не втрачає борти. Відповідно, нам також борти треба, тому що вони нас зараз дуже...
Right. This is, and here's the thing, we're talking like, oh, you're going to take some drone casualties. But remember, the alternative to drones is, first off, ground forces conducting reconnaissance, literally having reconnaissance groups leave defensive positions and cross into enemy territory to gather data. This is extremely dangerous and produces a very high level of casualties, in addition to potentially compromising information. The other alternative is to fly aircraft and have reconnaissance aircraft conduct these operations. And the problem is, again, you can have hundreds of drones on the battlefield for the cost of even a single aircraft. Let's say the average, let's say this is a high-end drone and it's $1,000. Well, if you're talking about a $20 million aircraft, I mean, literally, you're talking hundreds, even thousands of drones are able to be put into the air for the cost of a single aircraft. And even if Russia takes down 50% of drones every time, it still is better, as we've seen, than to have an aircraft that can fly one mission at a time, and every time it flies is in danger of being shot down by anti-air air defenses, right? So it's... you have to understand that even with a high casualty rate, the effects of these drones on the battlefield are huge. And you can see, this is, I mean, it's got some cool cameras, it's got the thermal vision, which is sick, but like, this is not ultra high-end military technology here. This is, you could buy something with probably 70% of this thing's capacities for a couple $100 on Amazon.
Розхідний матеріал.
Щоб розвідати, на одному зумі не розвідаєш, мусиш все-таки підлетіти кудись далі, залетіти, ризикнути. Тобто так само ризик є, ну як і будь-якій роботі військовій, ну ризик є.
Right, this is the thing. Imagine if proper reconnaissance, you've got to get in close, you've got to really get information on the enemy. And well, you imagine having to do that instead as a pilot or as a ground reconnaissance element.
Є всюди.
Yeah, this is the other hard thing, is determining where something is. And there's actually entire techniques called resections. I believe it's called resections, but in order to determine where a point in the distance is, if you don't have a laser rangefinder, you would need to know your location of your drone. You would need to know its exact distance and its exact direction in order to provide accurate artillery fire. You could also, if your drone is a civilian drone, it probably doesn't have the laser rangefinder and a very refined directional sense. And so instead, you can use two different drones. If you know which way they're facing and where those two are, you can actually map out a little triangle and determine exactly to the meter where your enemy target is, which, as we've discussed, Ukraine needs to conserve its shells and resources as much as possible. So only having fire missions where there's really strong accuracy is actually very important. Yes, it's hard to understate how important this is for a commander. Basically, I mean, the entire tactical concept of an ambush might have to be rethought in the era of the drone reconnaissance, right? When you notice early in the war, we saw a lot of ambush videos on both on the giver and receiver, so to speak. But if you reasonably believe that the enemy and or you will have drones in the air, ambushes have to change their fundamental character of how they're done. It will be a fascinating evolution to see how this goes.
Я ніколи не був готовий працювати професійним військовим. Мобілізувався на початку березня цього року. Так, адвокат це моя.
This is interesting. This guy's got an American flag patch. Huh. Interesting. I wonder if he's a foreign volunteer working with the artillery, or if he's a dual citizen.
Професія. До того працював в Києві. Настала війна, я пішов добровольцем. Звісно, у нас в підрозділі є значно досвідченіші побратими, які є кадровими і які, в принципі, готові були працювати фаховими військовими. Але насправді зараз стираються от такі межі між мобілізованими і контрактниками, да, і кадровими військовими, тому що війна і це бойове.
Yeah, this is how it goes. I mean, it was funny. We had a couple of soldiers arrive late to our deployment. They were replacing soldiers who weren't able to go for one reason or another. But we were probably 3 months in. And, it took about another 3 months for them to sort of learn the TTP, smooth out, get a feel for it. But the truth is, when you fall in as a less experienced soldier in an entire unit of experienced guys, your own professionalism and level increases so quickly, because when you're actually running operations, you don't need to develop unnecessary skills, if that makes sense, right? You're going to quickly learn the actual essential skills for that warfare. Whereas you have to remember, training is meant to prepare you for a wide range of combat situations. So it means, it's just like any other job, right? Learning on the job is worth 50 times. You learn 50 times faster than you would if you were, say, a college graduate, right? Because college, even at its most professional, right, when it's preparing you for, let's say, to be a CPA, they have to teach you everything you need to know about any possible accounting, whether it's being a CPA, whether it's doing auditing, whether it's doing corporate books or personal tax returns, or right, you've got to learn it all. In contrast, actually working in a firm, you're going to learn so quickly the ins and outs of your firm's exact specialty. No different in warfare, right? You learn everything you need for, in my case, military police operations, everything from running a police station and conducting a high-risk traffic stop, all the way to maintaining your ASVs, your armored security vehicles, counter-insurgency, counter-special forces, work, route reconnaissance. You have to learn it all. But when you actually go out there into the field, you realize that 80% of it isn't used in this particular war, right? Instead, you just need to double and triple down on the 20% that is used.
Братерство. Тут ми всі в одному котлі. У нас всіх одна ціль — знищити ворога, задушити його, тому що якщо в іншому випадку він задушить нас і свалом нас немає.
All right, that was pretty sick, guys. As always, of course, if you want access to the high-intensity combat video breakdowns, the kind that I can't show you here on YouTube, I do all that on the Patreon, and it's a great community. We have exclusive rooms on the Discord. It's a lot of fun. Interesting conversations in the comments. So thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons, and if you want to sign up, the link is down below. Cheers.